about the carbon cycle. And there are four cycles that we are going to learn about: carbon, phosphorus, nitrogen, and water. Carbon is probably the most important because it is the most important component or element for living organisms. In order to be organic, you got to have carbon. So let's go through, make sure we know what some of these background words are, and then we'll get out our drawing and sketch in the carbon cycle. Okay. So when we talk about a source, we're talking about something that gives off a particular nutrient. Sometimes students struggle a bit between the difference between a sink and a reservoir. A sink is something that accumulates a particular nutrient. So we're talking about the carbon cycle, we're talking about the atmosphere, ocean, forests, or soils. And a reservoir is something that contains a particular nutrient. And the two main reservoirs for carbon are fossil fuels and marine sediment. So you're probably going to want to get some notes on the side, and you're going to want the sketch notes for the carbon cycle. Okay, there's a lot going on, but probably quite a bit of this you already have some background knowledge on. Okay, so when we talk about carbon, carbon can be in the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. It can be in liquid as carbonic acid if it dissolves in water. It could also be in a solid. It can be in soil. It can be in living organisms. It can be in a fossil, as in fossil fuels, or it can be in sediments, like the bottom of the ocean. So it has the ability to be solid or liquid, and it moves back and forth between the various stages depending on where it's at any given time. Okay. Really and truly, the carbon cycle is driven by photosynthesis. Okay, so I'm starting up here. Carbon dioxide, CO2 is in the atmosphere, and it's taken in by plants. When a plant goes through photosynthesis, it takes the carbon dioxide and it converts it into glucose. Some of them, like plants, will store that carbon in the trunk. Other times, other plants will make things with it, like an apple or some food items or leaves that would then be consumed by a consumer. So for in this case, we had photosynthesis that made grass. The cow ate the grass. Some of the carbon dioxide was converted through cellular respiration back into carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere, taken in by the plants through photosynthesis, eaten by the cow. The cow can also release carbon in the form of its waste. And so its waste material can be incorporated into the soil by bacteria. And also, if this cow dies, its body is going to be broken down by those decomposers. So we're talking about worms, we're talking about bacteria, and fungus, right? Those three guys can break that carbon back down again into a form that can be taken up and reused. So the carbon cycle in terms of cellular respiration and photosynthesis, it's cyclical, and it's historically fairly even in terms of what is put out through cellular respiration is taken up by plants through photosynthesis. Here's a key spot where human behavior can jump in and change that. If you think about the Amazon forest, right, or the sequoia trees out in California, these large trees that are thousands of years old, humans have been coming through and knocking them out. So through deforestation, we've been changing and impacting the carbon cycle. If we don't have as many trees to capture that CO2, that means there's more CO2 in the atmosphere. And so if there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, it's going to have an impact, right? Because CO2 is accumulating in our atmosphere. So we'll come back to that. The other place where we see CO2 is that if it can be taken up by aquatic plants, it can also be absorbed by the ocean. And so if water and carbon dioxide mix together, some of that carbon dioxide will actually dissolve inside the water and make a weak carbonic acid. And so when we started recognizing that we were pumping in large amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere, we thought, well, hey, it's being absorbed by the ocean. Perfect, win-win. We're actually starting to see parts of the ocean to become acidified, meaning so much CO2 is being absorbed by the ocean that is creating small pockets of the ocean that are acidic. And if something is acidic, it means the pH value lowers. Some organisms can survive in that, some organisms are not. So that is something that we are dealing with because There are lots of communities that rely on the ocean for fish, for their economy. And so if the pH is changing, those economies aren't going to function the way they historically have. So that is another way in which humans are impacting the carbon cycle. Okay. Let me come back up here. Carbon dioxide is a key component of the carbon cycle. Right now we said CO2 makes up about 0.04% of the composition of the atmosphere, but we're increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. CO2 is a greenhouse gas. So that means that if we put more and more CO2 in the atmosphere, when the sun's solar radiation comes through, it can pass through into our atmosphere, but then it gets blocked. It can't make its way back out. So essentially, it creates a shield, allows that heat in, doesn't allow the heat out, so it causes more heating up of our atmosphere. Okay. Another issue with CO2 is that we have lots of it here locked up in our fossil fuels. When I ask students in class, where does our fossil fuels come from, right? Where did the oil come from? Where did the coal come from? Many times students say, oh, well, it came from dinosaurs. And that's not actually true. Our oil did not come from dinosaurs. Our oil actually came, we'll come back to that, from fossilized Jurassic sunlight. So during the Jurassic era, we had a different layout of our planet. And so this here is the Tethys Ocean. As these plates moved, you can see Africa swung over here, India moved over here, and it created a situation in such that what was part of the Tethys Ocean got landlocked and became what we call areas of like Kuwait, Iran, and Iraq. And so all the living organisms that were in this part of this Tethys Sea or Tethys Ocean, they died. And so if something was alive, it had carbon in it. And so we trapped mostly phytoplankton, but any aquatic organism that were in that ocean were subjected to heat, pressure, and a long amount of time. It changed that carbon from being a dead organism, turned it into crude oil. And so we call that fossilized Jurassic sunlight. Okay. So these fossil fuels that have been sequestered and holding on to this carbon for millions of years, we found it, and in the last 150 years, we started to burn it. Because when we burn it, we can convert that stored energy into something that does work for us. And so that's what we've got here going on in combustion. We use it for fueling our cars, for doing our flying airplanes, for basically energy purposes. And so we're distributing large amounts of carbon dioxide that had been sequestered and stored below ground, changing it from a solid form. Even if it was a liquid, it was still kind of like, solidified into something that is now a gas in our atmosphere. So again, human behavior inputting and changing the carbon cycle. Okay, so what have we addressed? So we've got the fact here that it's the cycle, right? Photosynthesis, a big part of it, cellular respiration, not just humans, but any living organism that breathes in oxygen discharges carbon dioxide. Those two could kind of equal each other out, but we are doing deforestation at such a great rate that's impacting it. We are also combusting large amounts of carbon, mostly through the use of burning fossil fuels. Again, adding large amount of CO2 into the atmosphere. We know that CO2 is a greenhouse gas that increases global climate change. If we change our planet, right, we're changing the abiotic components of our planet, it's definitely going to have an impact on the biotic component. What we're also seeing is by increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, more of that CO2 is being absorbed into the water part of the ocean, creating carbonic acid, which is lowering the pH of the ocean. So then that has an impact as well on organism in that. So when we talk about the carbon cycle, I really want you guys to pay attention to all the places human behavior is changing and impacting the carbon cycle. Okay, and how can we switch it or bring it back to, again, the status quo? Well, we can plant a tree, right? We can reduce the amount of red meat that we consume, which means there is less animals contributing to global climate change as well. Okay, so here's our question of the day.